Welcome to another of our NWBA reflections, which we offer as part of our support to individuals and churches through this time of isolation and lockdown. From our lockdown to your lockdown, you might say. And yet it's true that the last few months have taken their toll on us, but I've got to admit that I've heard from quite a few people who told me that they quite enjoy doing church online. You know, after all, we can now go to our Sunday morning services while we're still wearing our pyjamas. We can put the preacher on mute if we think they've gone on for a bit, or we can sing out of tune without anybody looking at us strange, and we can even listen to the sermon again if we find it particularly inspiring. So first of all, I think I better say thank you for listening, because apparently most people decide whether or not to stick with a YouTube video within the first 30 seconds. So according to my calculations, if you're still with me, I've just about made it over the first hurdle. Praying and worshipping at home might be something of a novelty for us, but it is by no means anything new. In fact, we're told in the New Testament that the early Christians regularly met together in their homes. Ah, yes, you may say, but they did get together. They weren't subject to pandemic lockdown and social distancing regulations like we are. But there are also many who did have to learn to pray and to discover the presence of God within the solitude of their own homes. And I want us to focus on one of them for a few moments today. Now, if you're a regular to these reflections, this is someone that we did take a look at back in October 2020. So if you're really keen, you could even take a look at what we said then. But I want to look at him in a slightly different way today. And the person I'm talking about is the Old Testament character Daniel. Daniel was someone who was forcibly taken from his homeland in Jerusalem and made to live in exile in Babylon. And there are two things that we learn about Daniel, two things that I think are actually deeply interlinked. The first is that he took his faith in God really seriously, and God blessed and gifted him. But taking his faith seriously was anything but plain sailing. In fact, he often found himself facing quite serious opposition because of his stand as a man of faith. But the other thing that we discover is that he did become a very significant figure. He may have been an exile, he may have been the captive of a foreign king, but he also became one of the most senior and trusted advisors in the royal palace. And yes, you can read his adventures about fiery furnaces and lions' dens, not to mention some quite supernatural episodes that he was able to make sense of, along with a whole series of visions and oracles that remain part of our scriptures to this day. But I want to invite you to strip all of that away and to focus on one simple episode in his life. And yes, as I said earlier, these are verses that we have looked at already once, but then we were very much trying to see them as part of a bigger picture. What I want to invite you to do today is to focus right in on these actions of a man who is praying. That moment when we're told that he knelt at the open window of his house, faced Jerusalem, and knelt to pray. And for Daniel, that didn't mean that he was able to say his prayers while still wearing his pajamas. In fact, it meant that he was trapped and eventually arrested, and the king was manipulated into punishing him. And I'll say a little bit more about that later. But for now, as I said, I want us to focus in on this scene of a man kneeling by his open window praying. Now, I know that a lot of people that I've spoken to in recent days are really feeling wearied by what we're going through at the moment. It's proving to be a long and troubling road, and we might be finding it difficult to pray. We might be finding it difficult to do anything at the moment. But I think Daniel's story may be able to offer us some help in that respect. So let me say from the outset that I don't think God is asking any of us to be a superhero right now, or at least if he is, that's not where it's going to start. Sure, Daniel was something of a significant character. He was incredibly brave in the way that he remained committed to his faith. He was gifted in the way that he could interpret dreams and the signs and the wonders that others experienced. He was very, very influential as he gave counsel to kings and to rulers. But when you look at his life, he never comes across as particularly trying to be any of those things. But what he does do is stay utterly focused on his faith in God and his relationship with God. And I think that's kind of what we need to do if we're going to get through this. So I want to invite you to look at some verses from Daniel chapter 6. We're going to start to read at verse 6. And I want you to try and forget anything you may already know about Daniel. Forget about his dreams, the visions, the fiery furnace. Forget about the fact that he's a high official and that this episode is going to land him in a den of lions. Just try to see him as an ordinary man saying his prayers as we look together at Daniel chapter 6, and I'm going to start to read at verse 6. So Daniel, as I said, has made his enemies, and his enemies are looking for a way to get to him. So these chief priests in verse 6 and satraps went as a group to the king and said, "May King Darius live forever." The royal ministers, the prefects, the satraps, the advisors and the governors have all agreed that the king should issue an edict to enforce a decree that anyone who prays to any god or human being during the next 30 days, except you, your majesty, shall be thrown into the lion's den. Now, your majesty, issue the decree and put it in writing so it cannot be altered, in accordance with the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be repealed. So King Darius put the decree in writing. Now when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened toward Jerusalem. And 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he had done before. I want to invite you just to hold that scene in your mind and offer you 3 things that might sustain us through these challenging times. And the first is that Daniel had a rhythm of prayer. Daniel knelt by a window and prayed 3 times a day. Now, I'm not saying that every Christian should pray 3 times a day, nor am I saying that we should always kneel to pray, nor am I saying that we need to go to a window that faces Jerusalem or Rome or our local church or anywhere else. But Daniel did have a place of prayer, he had a position of prayer, and he had a routine of prayer. And maybe that might be something that we should think about for a moment, about what those elements might mean for us. Because yes, he may have been able to interpret dreams and visions, but all of that was rooted in something far, far more simple. He had a regular rhythm of prayer. Have you ever found yourself on a holiday, or maybe on one of those days when you've got no real plans and you have a discussion about what you're going to do, but maybe someone's not there at the time, so you kind of put it on hold and pick it up later, and then maybe you get into a conversation with somebody else, or one of your children goes and finds a new friend and goes off to the playground together, and before you know it, the day's 2/3 over and you feel as if you've done nothing because you didn't have a plan. Because you've been free from your usual rhythms, because you haven't got those kind of markers in place for your day, so to speak, you end up simply getting a little bit lost and doing nothing. And I would suggest that the same can maybe sometimes happen in our spiritual life, particularly at times like this when our regular routines are disrupted or things are just very uncertain. And because we're different people, there might be different things that we find helpful in responding to that. A friend of mine has a prayer corner. It's not so much that he has a regular time slot, but he's got an old chair in the corner of the room with a pin board where he puts pictures of people that he prays for and letters or verses that have inspired him. And he just goes and finds that prayer corner a few times each day, and that's what keeps his rhythm of prayer alive. And again, because we're doing so much from home at the moment, with homeschooling and home services and Zoom meetings and working from home, perhaps it's difficult for you to create a space where you can go and regularly pray. Don't beat yourself up for that. I mean, Daniel was a very senior official. He could probably afford a nice house with a balcony and a Jerusalem-facing window. But I do want to offer you that encouragement to maybe find that space, find that slot in the day. Maybe something as simple as choosing to deliberately sit in a different chair so that you find a rhythm of prayer that works for you. And if you're a regular to these reflections, you'll know that I often encourage you to share in watching them with somebody else. So perhaps you could also work with a trusted friend to help each other maintain a rhythm of prayer. Maybe agree a set time, a couple of days a week, when you're going to call each other up on the phone and pray together. This is not about locking yourself into some great demanding ritual, but just recognizing that we all need those way markers, so to speak, to keep the rhythms of life going. And that includes our rhythms of prayer. And then I want to invite you to look at the direction of Daniel's prayer. He faced Jerusalem. Now, there's a whole load of things that we might consider that to mean. We may say that, well, maybe he was just feeling homesick and nostalgic for the past. Well, it's certainly true that Daniel never forgot his roots, but I'm sure he was also hugely dismayed by what had happened to his home city and nation. But if there's one thing you can't accuse Daniel of, it's living in the past. He was a senior official. He was very much about embracing the present. And if you read the second half of the Old Testament book of Daniel, he also had some quite significant visions of the future. Daniel faced Jerusalem not to hanker after the past, but to focus himself on his God as he embraced the present. This is a hallmark of Daniel's life throughout this book. I don't mind playing on the stage of world politics, he says. Frankly, I don't mind being thrown into a chamber of lions as a helpless prisoner. But what I will not do is lose sight of who I am as a child of God, whatever that means. And I sense that at the moment, many of us may have all kinds of feelings about the past, longing maybe for some aspects of it to return. I guess too, we might be looking at some of the things that we used to do and thinking, why did we ever do them in the first place? And we may also have all kinds of ideas about the future, whether that's some big family celebration to make up for all the ones that we've missed, or wondering how we're going to carry on using all these new technologies we've discovered once we move forward again as a church. And as Daniel looked to Jerusalem, it represented both of those things, his past and his present. It was the land from which he'd come, and it was the place to which he looked for God's restoration. But right now, he was in Babylon. And even though he knew of the king's decree, even though he knew it might cost him dear, he constantly and consistently centered his life on God. And I would gently suggest that as well as sustaining our rhythms of prayer, we also need to remember the focus of our prayers. And for us, that is not Jerusalem, but Jesus. As the book of Hebrews puts it, fix your eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of your faith. This is a season for us all to stay focused on Christ. And then, before we finish, I want us to take a look briefly at that bigger picture for a moment, as we think about the third thing here, which is the impact of his prayer. Now, I find that interesting because the immediate impact of Daniel's prayer was not for things to get better, but frankly for things to get worse. Because he prayed, his enemies and accusers were able to charge him with treason. And because the king had been tricked into declaring prayer to any other god as treason, the king was forced to cast Daniel into a den of lions. So however difficult it may seem to say, at a human level, we can't avoid the conclusion that, at least initially, it would have been better if Daniel hadn't prayed. And as I reflected on that, it made me notice something about Daniel's prayers. Now, I've got to be honest and say that my first instinct, if I was in a situation like Daniel's, would be to pray for the problem to go away. But look again at verse 10. Daniel knew about the decree. He knew what would happen if he maintained his rhythm and his position of prayer. And his enemies knew about Daniel's commitment to prayer. It was because they knew he was so consistent in his prayer that they could make the plan that they did to trap him and to trick him. But Daniel didn't pray for the problem to go away. He gave thanks to God. He focused himself not on the problem, but on Jerusalem, the foundation and the future of his faith. He focused himself not on the immediate events, but on the God that he served. And yes, the impact of Daniel's prayer was not only it landed him in greater difficulty, but this happened because he prayed, not because of what he prayed. Think about that for a minute. People were impacted simply because Daniel prayed. You know, some Christian traditions speak about prayer as the raising of one's mind and heart to God. And it seems to me that that's how Daniel prayed. Not because he looked for God to deliver on what he wanted or expected. And I want to encourage you to engage in your own prayers in a similar way. Recognize the value of prayer because it is prayer. Don't worry about whether God is giving you the answers you want or the answers that you don't expect. Recognize that if you have prayed, you have done something significant and valuable. Prayer is not so much about what we ask God for or what we ask God to do. Daniel wasn't praying because of what he wanted or what he hoped for. He was praying because prayer is the right thing to do. And I would say that valuing and committing ourselves to prayer, whatever the immediate consequences, whether things get worse or better, is something we need to do. It really strikes me that Daniel didn't pray because he was happy or unhappy with the situation that surrounded him, but because he recognized his need to constantly raise his heart and his mind to God, whatever the circumstances, whatever the outcome. So yes, we have here a senior official, a biblical prophet, a miracle worker, and so I could go on. But all of that is rooted in the fact that he was a man who, in the confinement of his own home, had a regular rhythm of focused prayer. And I don't think God is asking us to do any more than that at the moment. Of course, there will always be those significant characters and those big parts to play in the purposes of God. And if God calls you to do that, so be it. But as I reflect on Daniel, I'm reminded of the words of Jesus some centuries later. Seek first the kingdom of God, and all these things will be added on to you. Thanks for listening.